Well, good evening and welcome to Understanding Ag's webinar series. We are distinctly honored this evening to have with us Dr. Stephan Van Vliet from Duke University and the Duke Molecular Physiology Institute. And the title of Dr. Van Vliet's presentation this evening is Got Phytonutrients, Health Promoting Phytonutrients in Grass-Fed Meat and Milk. This will be, I think, an incredibly interesting webinar and very pertinent to what many of us do. Dr. Van Vliet is a nutrition scientist and metabolomics expert at the Stedman Nutrition and Metabolism Center at Duke University School of Medicine. He earned his PhD in kinesiology and community health as an ESPEN fellow from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and did postdoctoral training in the Center for Human Nutrition at Washington University in the St. Louis School of Medicine. His research is performed at the nexus of agricultural and animal health, which makes it so incredibly interesting for us. He routinely collaborates with farmers, ecologists, and agricultural scientists to study critical linkages between agricultural production methods, the nutrient density of those foods, and human health. He uses high-throughput metabolomic techniques to study the presence of bioactive compounds in the whole food matrix and their impact on human metabolic health. His work has been published in numerous journals, including the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, Frontiers in Sustainable Food Systems, the Journal of Nutrition, and the Journal of Physiology. So again, it is our distinct pleasure this evening to introduce to you Dr. Stephan Van Vliet. And Stephan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alan. To be here, and thank you much for the opportunity to present my work. And good afternoon or good evening to many of you, and thank you for attending my webinar on health promoting compounds in meat and dairy and their effects on human health. Emerging data indicates that a variety of health promoting plant compounds, also referred to as phytochemicals, such as polyphenols, terpenes, and other health promoting antioxidants, are directly transferred from the forage into the meat and milk of animals. Now, as meat and milk are often not considered as sources of phytochemicals, their presence has remained largely underappreciated in nutritional discussions on grass-fed meat and milk, which have predominantly centered around omega-3 fatty acids and conjugated linoleic acid. Now, what I'll discuss with you today is the data on antioxidants in animal foods and how the way that we raise our livestock potentially impacts human health. Before I will start the presentation, I just want to give you a few disclosures. I currently have current and research funding from USDA and FSR, USDA ARS, the Turner Institute of Eco-Agriculture, the Dixon Water Foundation, and the North Dakota Beef Commission. So I will start today's webinar with a brief background where I'll introduce the topic of red meat in dairy and human health and discuss the public confusion on their health effects. Thereafter, I'll provide you an overview of the impact of livestock production systems on the phytochemical richness of meat and milk. Then in part two, I will talk about the effects of grass-fed meat and milk on consumer health and talk about human nutrition studies that have been done in that space. And then finally, we'll look at a recent work by our group that compared novel plant-based meat alternatives with grass-fed beef to determine the extent to which beef and plant-based meat alternatives are nutritionally interchangeable or different. I will leave plenty of time for the second hour for a Q&A. Well, confused about red meat headlines in the news? Well, you're certainly not alone, and navigating discussions on red meat and human health are challenging. We get slapped with headlines every week that red meat causes cancer, heart disease, obesity, and other diseases of modern civilization. Now, this has led to wide-scale public health recommendations by the American Heart Association, the World Health Organizations, the dietary guidelines for Americans to reduce red meat consumption in an effort to halt metabolic disease. Now, these recommendations were challenged recently, or in 2019, in a series of papers from the NutriX Consortium, which were published in the Annals of Internal Medicine, that suggested that when looking at the associations between red meat and human health, that these were not perhaps as strong as we perhaps thought they once were. These findings were again countered by another slew of publications in high-profile journals that red meat is certainly not okay for health, despite that study claiming the contrary. Now, it is important to note that these data are associative data and mostly epidemiological associations, which generally means that participants fill out a food frequency questionnaire of what people ate over the last several months or the last 12 months, and their metabolic health, such as heart disease, obesity, or diabetes, is followed over many years, typically 10 to 20 years, and is linked back to the food frequency questionnaire. So this is associative data linking what we eat to our health. Now, one cannot help but wonder, as public confusion about red meat grows, and to a lesser extent dairy, and with the consumption of foods like fruits, roots, tubers, and meat being ingrained in evolutionary past, which have arguably contributed to our body and brain development of modern day humans, one cannot help but wonder when eating got so complicated, and if our ancestors spent nights sitting by the fire and engaging in endless discussions, as we often do, both in the scientific literature as well as on social media, on whether we should be consuming meat or if we should consuming plant foods, or perhaps both. I cannot help but wonder that our ancestors perhaps did not spend hours by the fire discussing whether they should roast meat or tubers. Now, we recently wrote a paper about these issues and try to shed some light on the public confusion about red meat and human health. Now, what we concluded is that several epidemiological studies, or most epidemiological studies, that find that consuming moderate amounts of red meat may be neutral or protective for health, whereas consuming red meat as part of a standard American diet, as you can see here on the right, where we consume this also with fries and soda and other ultra-processed foods, may increase the risk, or at least the disease risk association. So the next time you read a study headline, that is important to keep in mind. What is the background diet at which red meat is consumed? And the issue here is that many people in the US and globally are consuming a standard Western diet, which is also high in ultra-processed foods, low in fruits and vegetables, which also complicates the matter. And there's certainly some mechanistic insight that if we consume red meat as part of a phytochemically rich diet, both obtaining perhaps phytochemicals from meat, but also from plant foods, that we can perhaps offset some of the negative effects while obtaining the good of the meat, as meat provides many nutrients important both in the diet of young children who are in development, elderly, but also certainly throughout adulthood by providing bioavailable amino acids from the protein, zinc, iron, B12. So that is important to note. Now, meanwhile, in the field of environmental sciences, there are large-scale concerns about the environmental effects of livestock farming, with some high-profile reports, such as the Eat Lancet report, suggesting that we should limit our red meat consumption to approximately 0 to 28 grams per day, or approximately 14 grams of meat per day, and suggested a near abolishment of livestock production. On the other hand, reports such as those by the United Nations Intergovernmental Climate Change Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, suggests a critical role for sustainable livestock production systems in climate change mitigation, which can be achieved by integrating tree, crop, and livestock production systems while ensuring global food security and nutrient adequacy via the consumption of moderate amounts of animal foods and red meat. Now, while public health experts and climate scientists argue about whether we should rely on livestock production systems to meet the nutritional demands of a growing population while tackling climate change, those who produce our food, the farmer, is trying to figure out how to make sense of all of this and produce our food and make a decent living for their families. Now, to make a decent living, farmers must often balance trade-offs between land ecology, animal welfare, profitability, which in modern day farming practices are not necessarily in agreement with each other. High costs for inputs, but low income from farming has created high depression rates amongst farmers. Thus, in these discussions on sustainability and food policy, I think we must do a better job of considering farmers and communities and engaging them in the discussion. Now, sometimes I sit on panels about sustainable diets, and one thing I notice is that we never invite any farmers. So I always try to make a case that we should change this in the future and engage farmers in these conversations, because those are ultimately the ones that are producing our food and arguably, I would say, the most important player in this debate. Now, fueled by environmental and health concerns, increased consumer demand for local grass-fed meat and milk has been on the rise. For example, many consumers are willing to pay a premium if they are aware of the sustainability or the story of how their food was grown, and if this was grown in a sustainable or regenerative manner. Now, this increased interest in grass-fed meat and milk has encouraged a number of farmers to implement farming practices that many of you would describe as regenerative agriculture, which could be described as farming in harmony with nature rather than against nature. And by focusing on inputs, reducing inputs such as water, fertilizer, concentrate feeds, herbicides, by raising multiple species of livestock on diverse cover crops and perennial plants, farmers are increasingly implementing pasture-based systems that aim to improve soil health, plant biodiversity, climate resilience, and reduce farmer input costs. Now, my particular interest is, and in our group, is that do these practices that potentially improve soil health, plant diversity, animal health, have a trickle-down effect to the consumer? In other words, do they also improve consumer health? Now, these are some of the projects that we've been working on, and we're linking soil, plant, animal, and human health in both pasture-based systems and grain-fed systems by overlaying the metabolomes and seeing the nutrient transfer. And this is really what I'll start presenting you about in the next part. It is also important to note, and I alluded to this in the introduction, is that our work goes beyond omega-3 fatty acids and CLA. Now, the USDA database tracks only 150 components in foods. About 13 of those appear on nutritional labels. So that if a consumer would pick up a food or a package of beef, then we only see 13 nutrients appearing, only protein, carbohydrates, fat, as well as several vitamins and minerals. Now, this is only scratching the surface because the food matrix, or sometimes referred to as the human food metabolome, contains an estimated 70,000 unique metabolites that are capable of impacting human health. And I would argue that we're only scratching the surface. Now, many of these can have health effects, but they often remain underappreciated when discussing nutrition and human health, and also leads to nutritional reductionism, where we dumb down foods to individual constituents, but it's really the whole food matrix, and potentially a synergy between nutrients, which in the whole food matrix, and as mentioned, which contains several thousand unique metabolites that may be capable of impacting human health. These include polyphenols, terpenoids, tocopherols, carotenoids, and other phytonutrients, to name a few. Now, we are connecting the presence of these compounds in the food metabolome with the human metabolome, with the nutrigenome. In other words, disease-related gene expression, how that interacts with nutrients, and then also looking at the feedback, this all the way back to the food to inform what we potentially should be eating. And it also allows us to do so in appreciation of the whole food matrix, rather than associating single foods or single nutrients with human health. Obviously, we do not consume single nutrients like sugar or saturated fat. We consume those as foods and as part of complex dietary patterns. That does seem to modulate health associations. Now, what I'll focus on next are phytochemicals in animal foods. This is from recent work that we did. There are a wide variety of secondary plant components, such as polyphenols, terpenes, tocopherols, and other plant compounds that have potential antioxidant, antibacterial, cancer protective, as well as brain protective effects that are incorporated into grass-fed meat and milk. Now, I don't really like to use the word secondary. We usually call them secondary plant nutrients, but it somehow implies that these compounds are not important, but I would argue that they are. Before I present some of the data, I do want to talk a little bit about the techniques that we use and some other groups have used too. We use a technique called metabolomics, and we take biological samples. These can be, for instance, a soil sample, a plant sample, a food sample, as well as a human sample. We process these samples in our wet lab. We run them through a mass spec. We identify metabolites depending on the type of analysis that we do. If we do an untargeted exploration, we may identify 500 to as well as over 1,000 of metabolites. We do bioactivities and pathway analysis. As you imagine, if we end up with a lot of metabolites, we group them into classes such as phenolic compounds or terpenes for the analysis. So we cluster these metabolites into nutrient classes, and then we can overlay these metabolomes to look at the phytonutrient transfer. So in other words, what we may do is we look at the plant sample that the animal is consuming, and we overlay that metabolome with, for instance, a piece of meat, and to look at the direct relationship between the two and to really look at that phytonutrient transfer. And we can also, as shown here, we can start all the way with the soil and take us all the way to the human. And this is the project that we're working on now, which I'll present some pilot data from as well. In the next part, I will present work from a paper that we published recently in Frontiers of Sustainable Food Systems, together with my co-authors, Fred Provenza and Scott Kronberg. Now, I'll just start with the headline rather than building up to it. Pasture grazing results in higher meat and milk phytonutrient contents. As you can see here on the left, these are phytochemicals expressed as parts per million per kilogram of beef. And this was steers that were finished on more of a monoculture pasture, in this case pasture consisting mostly of fescue compared to grain finished animals finished on a corn-based total mixed ration. As you can see here, the amount of phytonutrients is about 3 to 4-fold higher in total. Now, this work was done on the right in animals that were finished or raised on very biodiverse pasture, over 20 different species, versus animals that were finished on a combination of hay and concentrate. Here, the amount is much more dramatic. It can reach about 20-fold increase. So it is important to note here that generally more biodiversity will result in higher amounts of phytochemicals in grass-fed meat and milk. Now, here are also some specific terpenes which are found in grass-fed meat and milk, known as alpha-cubanine or beta-caryophyllene. These are potential nutrients with antiviral or anti-cancer effect, anti-inflammatory effects, antimicrobial effects. Mostly been studied in animal models and in vitro models, but there's also some interventional data on this. As you can see here, these are either severely reduced in animals that are fed concentrate, or they are not detected at all in animals that are fed concentrate versus animals that are finished on diversified pasture. In this case, in this work, it was 8 major species of plants, predominantly consisting of perennial ryegrass as well as orchard grass. So these amounts of these terpenes that have potential anti-inflammatory, antioxidant effects may only appear in grass-fed meat or appear in concentrations that are often 5 to 20-fold higher. Now, going on with this is that these potential medicinal terpenes are upcycled in grass-fed meat and milk. 2 other common ones are alpha-pinene and beta-pinene. These are named after pine trees, and they're mostly studied for their medicinal effects in plant essential oils, herbs, and spices. But they are also found in grass-fed meat and milk. Their potential effects are anti-inflammatory, antioxidant, antiviral, anti-anxiety, and they have potential health effects for both livestock and humans. Now, it is important also to note is that while some of these also appear in plant essential oils or herbs and spices, such as, for instance, rosemary oil, we do get several what we think are unique compounds that we are commonly not found in some sources, such as alpha and beta pinene, also found risky in sagebrush and other plant species that herbivores may consume, but that are otherwise not readily consumed by humans. So this represents another dietary avenue by which additional and potentially unique health promoting terpenes may be ingested. Now, I want to present to you some work from diversified pasture with 10 major species. This was work done in goats and studied in goat's milk. The animals were mostly grazing on forage shrubs and woody plants. And again, here, the diversified pasture results in the concentration of chlorogenic acid. Now, chlorogenic acid is a well-studied antioxidant, particularly in the case of green tea. But as you can see here, it also appears in a cup of milk. Same with ferulic acid, as well as catechin, another potential antioxidant that has been predominantly studied for their presence and believed to be a reason for why green tea has antioxidant and anti-inflammatory effects. Now, as you can see here, when animals are finished on total mixed ration, in this case, 60% hay plus 40% grain, we cannot detect any of these compounds in milk. And the same was with meat. So that is potentially also a reason why the presence of these compounds have historically been underappreciated as dietary sources of grass-fed meat and milk. That is because unless the animals are finished on, particularly on diversified pasture, you often cannot detect any of these compounds. Now, what about when animals go into a feedlot? What is generally observed is that the phytochemical richness decreases during grain finishing, and this is from previous work that was already actually done in about 40 years ago in 1987. What the authors here did is they looked at what the amount of phytochemicals were on before the animals went into the feedlot. So they were exclusively grass-fed prior to this, as you can see here. Phytochemicals, parts per million. These are arbitrary units, but for just the sake of data, there are about 120 parts per million here. And we see a rapid decrease already after about 60 days on total mixed ration. We see a 2.5-fold decrease, and we see a further decrease as the animals are longer during the finishing phase and kept on total mixed ration. So you do see that there's a phytochemical richness decreases rapidly during grain finishing, and the same has been found in lamb meat, where looking at specific phytochemical, you see a rapid decrease during the grain finishing phase. So this is important to note. Now, one thing obviously to note in going forward also in the future is that this may be rescued slightly, and we're hoping to do some more work on this. What if we fed by phytochemically rich agri-waste? Can you maybe circumvent some of this? And also another important thing to note is, how does feeding byproducts, free choice on pasture, impact this? Can we then maintain phytochemical richness while potentially capitalizing on some agri-waste and still upcycling some of these nutrients into through the animal to increase at least potential sustainability and meet demand. Now, it is important to note that why do these phytochemicals appear in the meat and milk? Well, they're directly related to the amount of phytochemicals in forage. So what this work showed is that grassland pasture, and this is a milk polyphenol content here on the left, the forage polyphenol content here on the x-axis, whereas the milk polyphenol content on the y-axis. You see that high amounts of polyphenols in the forage translate to high amounts of polyphenols in the milk. And this was from animals that were kept on diversified grassland pasture. Now, if they are fed hay, you already see a rapid decrease in the polyphenol content in milk simply because the polyphenols in hay are decreased. Similar found in ryegrass, hay, ryegrass silage, and the lowest amount of phytochemicals were found in the corn-based TMR, and subsequently also the lowest amount of phytochemicals were found in milk from cows that were from dairy cattle that were fed TMR. So there is a strong direct relationship between the phytochemicals found in forage and those found subsequently in milk. Whereas the high polyphenol content in grass and pastures resulting in a high polyphenol content in the milk that is about 4 to 5-fold higher than animals fed hay or corn-based total mixed ration. Now this is other work that was done in lambs, and here again we see that there's a direct relationship between carotenoid intake, and this was done through alfalfa feeding, versus the carotenoid intake that is subsequently found in the lamb fat, with it plateauing with higher intakes. But as you can clearly see here, if the carotenoid intake is increasing, we also see this carotenoid increase in the lamb fat. And carotenoids are another potential anti-inflammatory and antioxidant phytochemical. Now, what are the effects of seasonality on the phytonutrient content? Obviously, as many farmers do, they have to supplement with hay throughout some portions of the year. Now, this was work that was done in France, actually. Obviously, during the winter, the animals also oftentimes are housed indoors, or if they were fed on pasture, they maybe fed hay or silage. In this case, 60% of dry matter intake came from hay and silage, and the other 40% was from pasture grazing. Now, as you can see here on the milk, terpene content is slightly decreased here in February, and it rises throughout the grazing season in May and hits a peak in July and goes down again in September. Now, are there potential ways around it? What if, for instance, the pasture has warm or cool season species, and animals are consuming more and more phytochemically rich amounts throughout the year? How does that impact things? And these are some of the questions that we hope to look at in the future. And obviously, you cannot control seasonality, but I think this is important to be aware of for farmers. And like I said, potential ways around it is for instance, feeding phytochemically rich agri waste during this period, or supplementing with other phytochemically rich feed, as well as maybe incorporating warm and cool season species. But these are things that need to be studied in the future, which we hope to do so in the near future. Now, it is important to note that for instance, if we look at beta-pinene, which was a terpene that I discussed earlier, that is a potential antioxidant. In pastured meat and milk, they do remain higher compared to concentrate fed animals. As is no surprise here, the amount of beta-pinene is relatively stable throughout the year because they're fed total mixed rations throughout the period. Whereas with the pasture fed animals, it can vary quite a bit depending on the time of the grazing season. Now, one thing I want to highlight here, and I cannot stress this enough, is the importance of biodiversity. Now, biodiversity has potential benefits for soil health, as well as pasture health, as well as animal health. Now, if you're able to raise plant species or raise animals on plant species diverse pasture, this also results in the highest phytochemical richness of meat and milk. And this is a very consistent finding in the literature, with more diversity resulting in a higher phytochemical richness of meat and milk, as mentioned, various terpenes, polyphenols, carotenoids, and tocopherols. And it is important to point that out, that things that one can do, especially when regenerating lands, is, for instance, incorporating biodiverse pasture seeding to incorporate or increase the biodiversity of the pasture, because plant species diverse animal products, if you compare it to a monoculture pasture, the amounts here of the phytochemicals may be also about 5 to 10-fold higher compared to a monoculture pasture, and is further reduced when animals are fed in feedlots on concentrates. Now, future work that as many farmers now are also incorporating cover crops and even grazing cover crops and the residues, it will be important to note also, how does cover crop grazing impact phytochemical richness, and can this be another avenue by which we can increase the phytochemical richness of meat and milk while promoting good land stewardship? Again, another unanswered question that needs to be looked at in the future. But what I cannot stress enough is the importance of biodiversity for increasing the phytochemical richness of meat and milk. And it is also important to note that this also likely relates to increases in soil health, because increases in soil health will likely benefit the nutrient density of meat and milk. And as I'll show later on, there may be a relationship between some of the micronutrients in meat and milk, and as well as soil health. Indeed, there's some work to suggest that greater soil mineral content will result in higher mineral content of beef from animals grazing these pastures. Now, a question that I often get is are these phytonutrients meaningful, and why not just consume plant foods instead? Why consume beef when you can consume a salad? Well, I would say it's not that simple, because compounds are upcycled from plants that otherwise not directly consumed by humans if we consume them through animal foods. Now, I certainly don't want to say that animal foods are the primary source of phytonutrients. Plant sources are the predominant source of phytochemicals in the human diet. They are about 5 to 20-fold higher, or sometimes even 100-fold higher, depending on the plant food that you look at. But it is important to note that these nutrients can be complementary. And how I often describe this is, for instance, let's take the example of zinc. We obtain bioavailable zinc mostly from animal foods. The bioavailability is higher, but we do obtain some zinc from plant foods too. So they have sort of a secondary role there. Now, with these phytonutrients, it can be the other way around, whereas perhaps the phytochemicals are higher in plant foods, but animal foods can still make meaningful contributions to overall dietary intake, thus raising overall dietary intake of these phytochemicals. And we can also likely obtain some compounds from plants that are otherwise not directly consumed by humans, thus the ability of ingesting some unique phytochemicals. And as I'll show you later on, meat also contains various other unique amino acids or peptides that are not found in plant foods. So I would often argue that rather than looking at this as a discussion in terms of plant versus animal foods, I would say both are complementary in the diet to promote nutrient adequacy and human health. But this work does suggest that grass-fed meat and milk can contribute to phytochemical intake in the diet. Now, for instance, important to point out is that, as I mentioned earlier, gallic acid and catechin are two antioxidants that have been studied predominantly in green tea, and are believed to be in part responsible for the potential health effects of green tea. Now, several green teas may contain about 1.2 milligrams of gallic acid or 4.3 milligrams of catechin per 100 milliliters of green tea. Now, if we were to drink 1 cup of or 100 milliliters of grass-fed, diverse grass-fed milk, we may actually obtain similar amounts of gallic acid and catechin in the milk as we would do with the green tea. Now, these are just two specific compounds, but it does illustrate, and I don't want to turn this into a plant versus animal discussion, but it does illustrate that we can obtain potentially meaningful amounts in animal foods too. Now, if we look at total phenolic compounds, and this is a gallic acid equivalent, which is a way of expressing the total phenolic compound in foods. Now, what we see is that, for instance, in plant food like eggplant or other roots or tubers, we see that the gallic acid equivalent of total phenolic compound is approximately comparable to grass-fed beef liver, and maybe a little bit higher, about the 3 to 4-fold higher than steak. But it is important to note that as mentioned, people don't often think of phenolic compounds appearing in animal foods, but as you can see here, this would contribute to dietary intake overall. Now, what about other nutrients, such as protein, vitamins, and minerals? Are there differences between grass-fed and grain-fed beef as well? Now, various studies have looked at this, and if we look at the protein content, there's generally no difference. And this was from work done out of Clemson by Suzanne Duckett. And here, the protein content was found to be similar. Cholesterol content found to be similar. Also, little difference between iron and zinc. But the B vitamins were found to be higher, specifically thiamine and riboflavin, vitamin B1 and vitamin B2, higher in pastured cattle versus concentrate finished cattle. And again, several authors have suggested that this may relate to both the forage content as well as potential soil health and soil mineral content. What about other nutrients, such as alpha-tocopherol, which is a well-known antioxidant with vitamin E activity? Here again, we see that this is about fourfold higher in grass-fed animals versus concentrate-fed animals. Similar is found with beta carotene, which is an antioxidant with vitamin A activity. So this is a precursor to vitamin A. Also, again, found in higher concentrations in grass-fed beef. Now, I do want to point out that not all grass-fed beef is created equal. And whether an animal is finished on biodiverse pasture or monoculture pasture, or as some farmers may do, pasture finish animals on grain, this would impact the amount of phytochemicals in the meat and milk. In this case, alpha-tocopherol and beta carotene. Here, and these were particularly looking at monoculture pastures of alfalfa, Bermuda grass, chicory, cowpea, and pearl millet. And we can see that there's a variety of alpha-tocopherol depending on the forage that the animals eat. Again, here a study that was done actually by Jason Roundtree's group that looked at various grass-fed beef producers, but some of the producers pasture finish on sorghum sides and soybean hulls. And as you can see here, beta carotene remained undetected, whereas the producers that were finishing animals on more biodiverse forage actually had the highest amounts of carotenoids here in the study. A similar thing is true for omega-3 fatty acids. Again, not all grass-fed beef is created equal. What this study found is that omega-6 to omega-3 ratios may range from a whopping 1.8 to 28.5 in a nationwide survey of U.S. grass-fed beef producers. Now, this 28.5 found in grass-fed beef of some of the producers actually starts to rival what is found in grain finished beef. And again, here producers where this was found was when animals were pasture finished on sorghum sides and soybean hulls. So this is highly dependent on the finishing forages and feed. So as my collaborator Fred Provenza often say, grass-fed beef is not grass-fed beef is not grass-fed beef, and he's very right at this. Is that there's tremendous variation even amongst the grass-fed beef producers, whether you finish on biodiverse pasture, on monoculture pasture, or even pasture finish on grains. Another question I often get is, what about organ meats versus muscle meat? Is there a difference in nutrients? Well, what has predominantly been studied is the DHA content. DHA is an omega-3 fatty acid, mostly been studied for potential neurocognitive as well as cardiometabolic benefits, so for heart disease, for instance. Now, I do want to point out to you is that, as you can see here, this is milligrams per 100 grams, 80 grams of DHA may be found in 100 grams of grass-fed beef liver, and about 20 milligrams of DHA per 100 grams may be found in grain-fed beef liver. Also with the grass-fed beef loin and grain-fed beef loin, again, the amount here is about 4-fold higher in the grass-fed beef. But please note here also, looking at the y-axis, that this is also milligrams per 100 gram, and this is milligrams per 100 gram. As you can see here, DHA in the liver is about 200 times higher than in muscle meat. Now, that is not to say that DHA from muscle meat cannot contribute meaningfully in an overall dietary pattern. Though the amount is small, it may still contribute, but it would sort of pale in comparison to fish. That is important to note. But if we look at other organs, such as liver, we do see that we obtain very high amounts of DHA. I don't have it here on this slide, but other organs such as heart and kidneys, they also contain DHA much lower than liver, but higher than muscle meat. So those are other ways of incorporating DHA. And even though we don't consume it anymore, we used to consume perhaps in the past, but grain is also very rich and the richest in DHA actually. Now, organ meats, if we look at the DHA and antioxidant profiles, the minimum to prevent deficiency of combined DHA and EPA is considered about 5 milligrams a day. But this is really a minimum. And some have suggested that this may even be a little bit lower than that. But a minimal amount is not necessarily an optimal amount. Combined intakes of 250 milligrams of combined DHA and EPA, which are the long-chain omega-3 fatty acids, are generally recommended by the World Health Organization and the European Food Safety Authority. This is based on randomized controlled trials as well as associative data that suggest potential neurocognitive and cardiometabolic benefits, particularly in children and older adults that seem to benefit the most. But that is not to say that even throughout the middle to late stage of adulthood, we would still benefit from this. But a lot of our DHA and EPA in our brain is especially incorporated in our early life stages. So it'd be important to increase or consume sufficient DHA and EPA, especially during growth and development phases. Now, about 100 grams of grass-fed beef liver can provide about 225 milligrams of combined DHA and EPA. So this would bring us up to that amount if we eat that on a given day. Other foods obviously also contribute, like such as fatty fish. Also, pasture-based eggs contain DHA and EPA, which are other sources of obtaining this. And I'll show you later on is that when consuming grass-fed beef, even muscle meat, we still see a rise in circulating DHA and EPA in the blood of consumers. Now, the phenolic compound, as I alluded to earlier, is about 4 times higher in the liver than the muscle. The phenolic compound shown here as a gallic acid equivalent, which is a general measure of total polyphenol content. Now, the conclusion of part 1, important to note is foods contain thousands of biochemicals that are potentially capable of impacting human health. I only presented a small amount of these phytonutrients here, but it is important to note that there's 10,000 of biochemicals that are capable of impacting human health. Phytonutrients, of which there are also 10,000s of, become concentrated in the meat of milk of animals finished on biodiverse pastures. They have potential antioxidant, anti-inflammatory, anti-cancer effects, anti-diabetic effects, which does need to be studied more in humans. But in vitro data and in animal data, this suggests to be the case. And again, we need to sort of replicate this in humans in the future, which is important. But their presence has remained largely underappreciated because we focus predominantly on omega-3 fatty acids and conjugated linoleic acid. Now, phytochemicals and animal foods, as I mentioned, do not negate or render obsolete the potential benefits of consuming also phytochemicals from plant foods. They should be viewed as complementary and contribute to overall dietary intake, but it is likely we are able to obtain unique phytochemicals because animals consume plants that you and I cannot consume. Now, next part, we're going to link livestock production systems to human health. Often we hear the connection between healthy soils, healthy plants, and healthy humans. Now, one thing that's predominantly been studied is the inflammatory response to grass-fed dairy and meat. Chronic systemic inflammation, illustrated by inflammatory cytokines such as IL-6, C-reactive protein, and TNF-alpha, play a role in coronary artery plaque formation, as well as other metabolic diseases. It can increase cardiometabolic disease risks, such as heart attacks, stroke, inflammation. Can also increase cancer, diabetes, and arthritis. Now, the metabolic effects of grass-fed meat have received some study attention for their ability to modulate inflammation and lipoprotein profiles. Starting with one of the earlier studies done in humans. This is acutely after a meal. Here, participants consumed either forage-fed meat. In this case, it was kangaroo raised on, or obviously a wild animal, grazing native forages in Australia, versus Wagyu beef that is finished on grain-fed concentrates. What the authors found is that acutely after consuming a meal, there's a dampening of inflammation and oxidative stress with consuming the forage-fed meat versus the grain-fed meat. This was found both in interleukin-6, IL-6, as I described from my previous slide, as well as C-reactive protein, which are important inflammatory cytokines. Now, we commonly see a little bit of an increase in inflammation after the meal, but this is attenuated or at least decreased after consuming forage-fed meat. So consuming antioxidants to dampen that inflammation afterwards is important, and one way of doing that may be by consuming forage-fed meat. But important here is that the animal is confounded because it's beef versus kangaroo. So is it the forage? Is it the animal? And this work needs to be replicated in future studies. And there's actually a study that we're working on right now is replicating this with grain-fed and grass-fed meat, which we recently started. Now, another study found that consuming half a pound of pecorino cheese per week for 10 weeks reduced inflammation. It changed in interleukin-6, whereas the placebo, which was a grain-fed cheese, slightly raised inflammation. So this was anti-inflammatory. Now, another study that was done in the US, where participants consumed 5 4-ounce patties per week for 5 weeks, did not see any impacts on inflammation with grass-fed versus grain-fed beef. Now, the findings of this are at present unclear, and it is important to note is that the background diet is also important, and in this case, also the dose that we get might be important. So, diversified versus monoculture pasture, could that be an explanation? Perhaps. Here, the animals in the pecorino cheese study, they were finished on diversified or raised on diversified mountain pastures in Sardinia, Italy, whereas the grass-fed meat in this study was finished on a Bermuda culture or Bermuda monoculture pasture. And remember from earlier is that biodiversity is very important. Now, the time frame could be also a reason, 10 weeks, but also, as I mentioned, the background diet. Again, obviously, the background diet in which we consume these foods are also important, and it could also be the dose, because I would argue that if people consume grass-fed meat, they're also likely to consume pasture-raised eggs or grass-fed dairy, as well as pastured pork, and perhaps even plant foods from regenerative systems. So this is important to also study in the future, and how does a diet rich in regeneratively produced products versus more of a conventionally produced diet and the entire diet, both plant foods and animal foods, impact human health. And I think those are important next steps to look at. Now, this study was done in Argentinian adults, and they consumed half a pound of beef per day for 4 weeks, much more than in the previous studies. Now, these are also Argentinian adults, and Argentinians are well known to consume high amounts of red meat. Which is the authors saw here is that there was at least a trend for an increase in circulating alpha tocopherol and beta carotene. Again, these are vitamin A and vitamin E precursors. So the amount circulating in the blood was higher after, or at least trending to be higher after consumers, when people consumed grass-fed versus grain-fed meat. Now, what is well known and well established in the literature is that when we consume grass-fed meat, that DHA, which is a long-chain omega-3 fatty acid, which I described earlier, increases in the blood of consumers, and also the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio decreases and actually becomes improved in the grass-fed group versus the grain-fed group. So while it's often said that the amounts of DHA in muscle meat are meaningless, and people often compare that to things like fatty fish or salmon, which is maybe not a truly fair comparison, but it's often portrayed as not being important or not impacting the amount. Well, I would disagree with that, because there's various studies like this showing that if you consume grass-fed meat, this was a pound a week, you do see an increase in circulating omega-3 fatty acids when the background diet is kept the same, which suggests that even muscle meat can contribute meaningful amounts to the amount of circulating omega-3 fatty acids in participants, and does contribute meaningful to the diet. Now, the conclusions of part 2. Research is sparse. Some studies show potential for anti-inflammatory effects and improved lipoprotein profiles when people consume pasture-raised meat and dairy. There's no direct linking to pasture diversity and soil health in any of these studies, though, and I think that's a limitation of the literature, and this is what we're currently working on. As a result, it doesn't allow for this direct linking back of livestock production practices. So most of the human nutrition studies, and I think this is also because maybe working in academic silos, they study grass-fed beef, but there's not a clear description or a clear linking back to the pasture that the animals were raised on, or the phytochemicals in the forage or in the meat and milk. Now, what I do feel comfortable saying is that biodiverse pasture-raised meat and milk looks certainly a lot healthier on paper, but we need to really connect the dots by doing this through greater collaborative efforts between farmers, agricultural scientists, as well as human nutrition scientists like myself. One of the things that we're working on is what we call a GRAZE project. It's pasture-raised beef from farm to table to us. What we do is we do metabolomics on the soil, on the forage, on the grass-fed beef, as well as the human. And we overlay all these 4 metabolomes to look at the nutrient transfer and to really get after direct linkage between soil health, plant diversity, animal health, and human health. And this is a project that we started recently, and I want to present a little bit on the on-farm sample collection that we've been doing. Now, we collect soil samples here, and let me see if I can show you this. Here is a small amount of soil is collected at a depth of about 5 centimeters. We sample conventional cornfields as well as biodiverse pasture about 1 mile apart. So these are essentially the same soil types, but very much different ways of using the land. Whereas this is more conventional cornfields that goes into the commodity market, or either in what some farmers do is they make total mixed ration out of it, versus biodiverse pasture. Oftentimes, grazing has been obviously considered destructive to the land, whereas maybe also monoculture pastures. But here we're looking to see how soil sampling impacts the metabolome profiles and soil health. And here's a collection of the soil at that depth by a collaborator, Dr. Alan Franz Lubers. Now, here are the plant samples that we collected. And this is samples that we collected at BDA Farms with Dr. Alan Williams, as well as total mixed ration samples. As you can see, the difference is very clear, and we're doing metabolomics on both these samples and comparing the phytochemicals in these samples versus these samples. We are also using UAVs to characterize pasture health. And we are looking at the vegetation, which we can do a vegetation index as well as the figure of this vegetation, and also link that back to our metabolomics. Then we are collecting grain-fed samples and grass-fed samples. We are also collecting stool from the animals. We're collecting stool samples from the cattle, study the cattle gut microbiome, much like we do in humans. And then we want to see if there's a relationship between, because there's some recent work that came out. Again, it's associative data, very new in one of the Cell journals, that's links antibiotic use in grain-fed or in CAFO-finished animals with the appearance of antibiotic-resistant genes in the human microbiome of people that consume high amounts of grain-fed beef. So there's at least some epidemiological suggestion for a direct relationship. Again, this needs to be validated in future studies. But one of the things that we're trying to do is we collect stool samples from the cattle. We also collect stool samples from our consumers, and we see if there's maybe a relationship with these antibiotic resistance genes, and also looking at alpha and beta diversity. Diversity in the cattle. So essentially what we're linking is the health, the gut microbiome of the cattle to potentially the gut microbiome of human consumers. Again, here I showed you this is that we are overlaying all these metabolomes in our work, and we're really going at it from soil to all the way to the human. This is current ongoing work by Sarah. Presented a little bit of data earlier on about this, but this is what we'll be working on for the next several years, and hopefully we can build this up, start working with more farmers, and really start connecting these dots. Because right now the bits and pieces are more of the human data and the animal data, but we really need to start fusing these together, which we will start doing in our project. And we're looking for more collaborations and also further research funds as we try to build up this line of work. But we're off to a very good start. Final thing I want to just quickly highlight to you. Increased interest, and I'm sure you've seen it all in the news headlines, is the plant-based meat alternatives. Now, we were interested in this as scientists because we often hear is that plant-based meat alternatives are bona fide nutritional replacements to beef. In other ones, they're one-to-one nutritionally interchangeable. Now, I talked to you about earlier is that we have thousands of compounds in food sources. So if we look at this and sort of peel back the onion layer here, what is the difference between grass-fed beef and some of these plant-based meat alternatives, which are very much both being marketed as healthier alternatives and probably more market competitors. So, or at least that's how they present it to the consumer. Now, similar nutrition labels, does that mean nutritionally equivalent? One label is a beef burger, the other one is a plant-based meat alternative. The question is which? Similar amount of fat, similar amount of protein, various micronutrients here, also various micronutrients here. And you may have picked up on this, but on the right is the plant-based meat alternative. On the left is the ground-fed beef. Important to note is that these micronutrients are fortified, as well as the protein is from isolated protein sources, in this case, soy protein. So essentially this is matched to match the ground beef. If you couldn't tell the difference, no worries. 50% of consumers in a recent consumer survey also could not tell the difference and believe that the beef and the plant-based meat alternative is nutritionally interchangeable. Now, oftentimes what I hear is that that meat consists out of protein, lipids, vitamins, and minerals, and all these things can be found in plants. So we can make beef from plants. Now, it is obviously much more complicated than that, which is our metabolomics data would suggest. And as one of the, as is often mentioned, is that should we see this as direct nutritional replacements? Well, we put this to the test. We acquired samples, a very popular plant-based meat alternative, and as well as beef. Did our regular study workflow. Processed the samples, ran them through a mass spec, identified the metabolites, did false discovery rate adjusted statistics and multivariate analysis, and then bioactivities and pathway analysis, clustered these metabolites into individual nutrient classes. So I'll present to you our metabolomics data, starting with a principal component plot. What this analysis does is, after you have all these hundreds of metabolites, the program uses an unsupervised method of trying to figure out which samples cluster together based on these metabolites, irrespective of the source, whether it being plant or animal meat. in the computer model, and then the model figures out which samples clusters together. Now, what you can see here on the right are the plant-based meat alternatives, and all the way on the other side of the principal component plot is the grass-fed beef. Now, if these products were indeed nutritionally interchangeable, the green dots would overlap with the red dots. This would all be a cluster. They would all be sort of intermixed together. Now, even if you're not a metabolomics expert, you can see here that the difference is literally day and night. Grass-fed beef is not a plant-based meat alternative. Plant-based meat alternative is not grass-fed beef. They are, based on this, not nutritionally interchangeable when you consider the whole food matrix. So while the nutrition label may look similar, if we look at the whole food matrix, there are very much, there are large differences. We actually found that 90% out of identified metabolites, and we had a large number of unidentified metabolites too, which we're working on now, but 90% of the metabolites you identified, and this was just pilot work, we found were different. In this case here, in the green, is the plant-based alternative. In the red is the ground beef. Red here, next to each of all these individual metabolites, means higher amounts. Blue means lower amounts. In this case, red is very high. Blue is complete absence. Now, as you can see here, various phenolic compounds common to soy, phenolic acid, sulforol, are only found in the plant-based meat alternative. On the other hand, various antioxidants such as spermine, allantoin, cysteamine, anserine, squalene, glucosamine, creatine, which play crucial roles in antioxidant defense systems in our body and are important for brain health. These were only found in beef and not in the plant-based meat alternative. So these are just a few examples of that indicate that large nutritional differences exist once we look simply beyond protein, vitamins, minerals that appear on nutritional labels. So this is very important for consumers to note. Just like adding carotenoids and fiber to a sausage doesn't make it a carrot. Adding some isolated proteins, vitamins, and minerals does not make a plant-based meat alternative meat. So they are not nutritionally interchangeable. We cannot determine from this data whether one is healthier to consume than the others. That is also not the goal of this work. Obviously, consumers should be free to choose whatever they want to eat, but it is important to note is that these products are not nutritionally interchangeable, and I think that is important for consumers to note. That mimicking foods using isolated proteins underestimates the nutritional complexity of whole foods in their natural states, which contains thousands of phytochemicals and biochemicals capable of impacting human health. And I know that the discussion often is plant versus animal foods, which is very inflammatory. And I prefer to view animal and plant foods as complementary rather than being in competition, as is so often the case in these discussions, especially whole food sources. And indeed, many farmers are integrating crop livestock systems and are producing both plant and animal foods. So on a lighter note, you might just want to grow both in an integrated crop livestock system. But in all joking aside, it is important. We have major challenges in our global food system. We need to increase production by 60% by 2050. We need to do so in a sustainable manner. We need to do so in a manner that improves nutrient density. So it is important that we view these as complementary rather than competitive in this scenario, and again focus on arguably on whole food sources that can be healthy to consume. And if people want to adopt a flexitarian approach, obviously, consuming some plant-based meat alternatives, I do not see have per se a negative health effects or anything. And obviously, it will get very complicated very quickly when we look at some of these nuances, as I talked to you about earlier, the background diet being most important. What important to note is that plant-based meat alternatives are not a one-to-one nutritional replacement to beef, and vice versa. With that, I would like to acknowledge several of the individuals that helped with this work, both the Duke Molecular Physiology Institute, as well as the USDA ARS, specifically also Scott Kronberg and Fred Presenza, also working with Pablo Gregorini in Lincoln University in New Zealand. And obviously a special thanks to all the farmers that have been involved in this work, BDA Farms, Hickory Nut Gap, Beaver Creek, all the spring ranch, and hopefully working soon with brown, with Great Brown. We're doing work. So also with Willow Creek Ranch and Thousand Hill Farms, hopefully in the future, and hopefully many more to follow as we want to build this up. We would like to look at this in various farming operations, various soil types. And one of the hypotheses would be here is that if you adhere to soil health and diversity principles, you can adopt this potentially to what suits your farming needs best. And this would likely result in a phytochemically rich piece of beef. But we want to build a database on that and start studying this more. With that, I would like to thank you and open it up to questions and discussions.
Well, Stephan, we really appreciate that. Thank you so very much. What an incredible presentation, and just absolutely packed with fantastic information. So we are deeply grateful for you doing this for us this evening. I'm going to start. We do have a number of questions. I'm going to start with the first question. Are there any regulated nutrition and health claims on phytochemical content in milk and meat that are currently being used anywhere in the world?
No, to my knowledge, not. No, there's no official stamp that you can put on your food label at this point to say, okay, this is antioxidant rich or anything like that. No, I think as I mentioned, the amount of phytochemicals, they haven't been appreciated and studied as much. More recently, this has been recognized. So at the moment, there is not any per se regulation of this. So
yeah, and certainly none that I know of either. So I think that's correct. There just hasn't been enough research at this point to be able to do that. The second question comes from Willie, and this question is, do you think that the lesser known and studied micro and nanonutrients like chromium and cobalt, selenium, and so forth could play a role as coenzymes in the natural synthesis of these phytochemicals? Where higher biodiversity is observed, the microbial connectivity with minerals make these available, whereas with monocultures, this does not happen.
Yeah, I definitely think that is a very plausible hypothesis, and there is some work to suggest that grazing more mineral-rich soils concentrates more minerals in grass-fed beef. So I definitely think there's a relationship. And also, while this hasn't been studied, particularly to my knowledge, at least particularly in biodiverse pasture or biodiverse fed livestock, we do know indeed, as the person asking the question points out, is that many of these vitamins and minerals play a role as cofactors. So it is very plausible, I would say, based on just that knowledge of physiology, that that is a reason, yeah, that increasing soil health indeed, and having a greater mineral content in forage can play a role in also the phytochemicals. But I do think it's important to note that is also, and this is a little bit out of my area of expertise, but that this is also probably related to the level of the plant, I would say also. But what I do know is that amino acids that are synthesized, perhaps things such as taurine or anserine and things like that, and they do seem to able to discriminate between grass-fed and grain-fed beef, because these amino acids, they do rely on various cofactors and various vitamins and minerals. So yeah, I definitely think it's plausible.
Very good. A question from Khalil. Just as with the unique relationship between beef concentrated omegas and the plant species mentioned, are there any studies showing a relationship between beef or milk concentrated phytonutrients and the plant stinging nettle? And Khalil says, from the herbalist perspective, this plant is phytonutrient rich.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any studies looking specifically at that plant, but it is very well established is that when cattle consume phytochemically rich plants, and that there's the direct relationship between the phytochemically rich forage and what appears in the meat and milk. So if cattle are consuming very phytochemically rich plants, and that would definitely result in more phytochemicals in grass-fed meat and milk. So yeah, I would say that again, it's very plausible that that would be the case, and that would be a way of increasing the phytochemical richness of meat and milk, and if animals consume those types of plants.
Great. The next question is from Luke, and Luke says, will there be any studies that compare a regeneratively raised grain crop or TMR ration versus the same in a conventional system? Would you expect there to be a difference?
Yeah, I think so, because again, there's been more work done on cropping systems, and what has been shown is that improvements in soil health and perhaps raising crops in more regenerative systems can improve the nutrient density of these crops. So then if these such as grain and corn are subsequently fed to animals, the TMR would be more phytochemically rich. So presumably this would also then, when we grain finish, would also result in more phytochemically rich grain finished animals, and also things like for instance cover crop grazing, if those are, or crop residue, if those are phytochemically rich, I definitely see an opportunity there. And I must also say, and this is perhaps my personal opinion, is that I don't think there's per se anything wrong with feeding limited amounts of grains. This could be a good way of upcycling agri waste, provided it is true waste products and not per se grown for it. So that is important to know. But it does provide a unique way of doing that. And one of the things that I would like to study in the future is that indeed, as you mentioned, if we have some of this phytochemically rich crop residue or agri waste, and we provide that to animals free choice on pasture, how does that impact the phytochemical richness? Because this could obviously be a way of especially in times where there may be not as much grass available, or decrease the risk of overgrazing, when there's opportunities to feed agri waste or byproducts to animals. But yeah, that's a little bit of an open question, but I definitely think that's important to study.
Excellent. The next question: have you looked at shifts in rumen microbiology based on forages? I read one study that showed more grains in the diet increased the presence of E. coli. I've also read that forage compensation impacts the amount of methanogenesis. Have you looked at any of this?
We have not at present, but we are looking at this in our study that we started collecting data from. So that's one of the things that we're looking at in the stool samples. And indeed, as the person asking the question points out, there is some reason to suggest that there is a decrease in alpha and beta diversity, also in the microbiome of the animal, and indeed perhaps increased pathogenic bacteria. So that is definitely a good point. And indeed, initial data suggests that with that grain-fed animals versus grass-fed animals do show shifts in the microbiome, and perhaps indicative of less diversity and perhaps I don't usually like using words healthier or unhealthier microbiome, because simply we just don't know, I guess, enough about the microbiome to truly say, okay, this is healthier microbiome, this is an unhealthy microbiome. Where we have sort of ideas about what looks healthier, what doesn't look healthier in terms of biodiversity. But there's definitely some suggestions to suggest, indeed, or some data to suggest that the microbiome of the grain-fed animals perhaps is different and perhaps not as healthy as the grass-fed animals. So
I've got another question for you, Stephan. considering the fact that for those that are doing year-round grass-fed production and harvest, there are potentially going to be time periods when those cattle are going to be on more of a stored forage diet versus a living forage diet. It's very evident from your work, there are definitive differences from your and other studies, in the phytonutrient content. However, considering that diet and impact on health is a lifetime cumulative effect, do you believe that it would still be far healthier in one's diet to still consume the grass-fed beef year-round, regardless of, when you can, when it's finished on growing green grass, and then at the other times on the storage forages versus a conventional TMR ration?
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. I mean, even in the winter, grass-fed meat and milk is still more phytochemically rich than animals that are fed total mixed ration. So yes, even in the winter, when the phytochemical richness in grass-fed beef and grass-fed milk may be at its lowest, it is still more phytochemically rich than grain-fed counterparts. So certainly, I would say yes, year-round is definitely a way to go. But I think, and again, I mean, perhaps there's not much you can do about this as a farmer, but I think it's just important to be mindful of, and maybe think of ways or investigate ways by which maybe we can mitigate some of that, some of these decreases by maybe supplementing some phytochemically rich supplements or waste products, for instance. So I think that is important to potentially study in the future, to look at that too, see if we can sort of counterbalance that. And also important to note is that if you are able to obtain a lot of biodiversity and high forage quality during the summer, then yes, maybe you see some of this decrease over the winter. But if you start higher, then obviously your bottom is going to be higher also after that. So that is also important to note. So, but yeah, certainly will remain higher than grain-fed counterparts.
Okay. We do have several requests, Stephan, for potential access to the slides. I don't know if that's possible or not, or if in PDF format or something, but I'll leave that up to you. But I do want to let our audience know that this webinar is being recorded in its totality, including the Q&A session, and that will be archived and available for viewing and reviewing on our website. But Stephan, if there is any way that you want to make the information available, then we would be happy to disseminate that.
Sure. Yeah, for sure. I can provide you with a PDF of the slides, and feel free to. I can put a link, send you a link to it or something that can be with like in the notes of the webinar or something like that. We can. I'll be happy to provide a copy of the slides for sure.
Excellent. Okay, a couple of other questions. One is, would you expect large differences in the proteins produced by monogastric animals? So, pastured pigs, things like that, raised on diverse pasture versus being grain-fed?
Yeah, I would certainly. I mean, it is known that monogastrics such as pigs and chickens forage. They do so, and they consume some of the phytochemically rich plants. So yes, again, I would also think that that is certainly the case versus grain-fed counterparts that are exclusively fed grains. And another important part is obviously just being outside for the chicken and getting exercise in, right? Just being able to walk makes them metabolically healthier, and maybe would improve also the healthfulness for us. I mean, there hasn't been as much work done on monogastrics. There has been studies done on eggs, And in eggs, yes, you do see, but again, this has mostly been studied in the context of omega-3 fatty acids, some work on antioxidants, but yeah, we have future plans, and we hope to build up this line of work by also looking at monogastrics, looking at eggs, looking at poultry meat, looking at pork, to see if there's an impact. And there's definitely been some work done in pork too, and showing higher antioxidant contents in pigs too. So yeah, it certainly would also hold true for poultry and pork. And again, what it boils down to is, and this is related to a question someone asked earlier, if you're able to feed grains that are from a more of a regenerative operation that provides more nutrient dense grains, then I would also hypothesize that feeding these more nutrient dense grains also increase the nutrient density and the phytochemical richness in monogastrics. So that could be another way of improving that, even though if they are grain fed, then obviously pigs and poultry would consume more grains. Then if you're able to feed more nutrient dense grains, then yeah, there's no reason to believe that that would also not improve the phytochemical richness of pasture-based or regenerative fat poultry and pork.
I would have to agree with that as well. The next question, do you think that freezing meat affects the phytonutrient content? Good question. I'm not sure if people have looked at freezing that much. Generally, what I do know about other compounds, like for instance vitamin C and carotenoids and tocopherols, is that there's only a very slight reduction, in a couple of percent. So I would think that maybe yes, it would decrease slightly, but not to a great extent. But now that you mention it, and that's why I love these questions, I think I'll keep some of the pieces of meat in my freezer for a year or two or a year, and then study the same ones again and see if there's a difference. So thanks for pointing that out, and I can let you know in maybe a year or two how that impacts it. One thing I do want to highlight, and to segue into this question made me think of it, is that cooking does decrease the phytochemical richness, and different methods of cooking can do that, especially longer cooking times would decrease the phytochemical richness versus maybe slower temperature cooking, preserves it more. In the case of milk, now I know it's not very common in the US, but I'm European, and we can consider it a blasphemy to pasteurize our dairy prior to cheese making. And pasteurization has also been shown to decrease the phytochemical richness. And also important to note is that a lot of these phytonutrients are also flavor compounds, and that is generally why pasteurization in Europe, if you look at Swiss cheeses, French cheeses, Dutch cheeses, world famous cheeses, they are generally not pasteurized because these phytonutrients are also flavor compounds. So it might alter their flavor a little bit and taste less rich. For instance, by law, if you want to sell authentic Dutch Gouda, you cannot pasteurize it. It's written by law that this is not allowed, and it has been well demonstrated that that also preserves the phytochemical richness, and also can improve taste. So that is also something to be mindful of. I do think it's also getting more artisanal cheese making, getting more common in the US too, and but yeah, that has also been shown that cooking can decrease it. Absolutely. And so the question back on, how does freezing the meat affect the phytonutrients? It was asked predominantly because as producers, would we be better off trying to harvest animals at times of peak plant species diversity and then freezing the meat, for sale throughout the year?
Yeah, there's definitely something to be said for that. And I think commonly, but you can probably, or a farmer can probably explain this better. But I do think traditionally a harvest season was always in the fall, right after grazing season. Is that correct, Alan?
Yep.
Yeah, so I think people probably didn't know why they did that. Well, probably because the animals were most productive. But yeah, that is generally probably maybe modern science has validated what perhaps farmer wisdom already knew a while back, is that you want to harvest in the fall, right after, because then there's peak phytochemicals. So if that's possible, sure. But obviously we also have constraints with processing, obviously. So I would say, and tying back to it, yes, the fall would probably be the highest, but as we mentioned, grass-fed beef will still be phytochemically rich, even during other times of the year, but perhaps not as phytochemically rich as right after the grazing season.
So then back to the comments you were making about different methods of cookery and their potential impact on the retention of the phytonutrients. Are you making an argument for beef tartare?
Well, well, I would say I'm making an argument for not charring your meat until it's completely dark. And but so tartare is interesting, is that that might be the case. But what is well known though about which is the digestibility, particularly protein digestibility, is that cooking improves protein digestibility. Now I'm not sure about phytochemicals. I mean, you see a decrease, and I do not per se think that this holds up for phytochemicals, but there may be some other nutrients that have also a decreased bioavailability, at least with protein. But then again, sometimes you see the availability or the digestibility increasing again when you, for instance, cure meat. Like traditional curing methods, salt curing. You actually see an increase in digestibility versus maybe a cooked steak. So yeah, I must admit I'm not 100% sure how that would impact it. So that will be also another interesting way of looking at it. I'm not sure if the IRB lets me feed tartare to people if I don't cook it to a high temperature, but that may be a little bit of an uphill battle. We'll see. Maybe I can make a case for it.
Well, I'm going to make the claim, Stephan, that we heard it here tonight, that medium rare is the best way to prepare meats.
Yes, I would agree with that. It would argue for taste, and it would also preserve more phytochemicals than cooking it well done. That's what various studies have shown, indeed.
Amen. So
slow cooking, another way of preserving. If you slow cook it at low temperatures,
yes,
that could be another way.
Absolutely, I would agree with that as well. Like a great slow cooked brisket or ossobuco, shanks, that type of thing, fabulous when you slow cook them. So I think that's the end of our. Well, hold on, let me double check here. Nope, got one more. So this question says, doesn't grain, regardless of phytonutrient content, still alter the omega-3 to 6 content of a ruminant?
Yeah, I would certainly think that's the case. Yeah, I agree. And grain, we know, are not as phytochemically rich as some of the forage that is fat. So yeah, it would still likely alter the omega-3 or omega-6 fatty acid, depending on what is fat, though. I guess if you maybe feed more things like flax or other grains or crops that are more rich in omega-3s, then perhaps that could be a way to mitigate some of that. But yeah, with corn and things like that. Or the stiller grains, yeah, those are always going to be very high in omega-6, and no matter how phytochemically rich, and they will also not be as phytochemically rich as just the fresh forage, because you can even see it there, right? Even if you take the same forage and you feed that as hay, then you already see a decrease not as much as feeding total mixed ration, but you already see a decrease in the phytochemicals from the same plants, the same grass. So that is certainly a case that there's an aspect of time involved too after harvesting when you see this decrease.
We have another question that just came in. How do the phytonutrients, especially anti-nutrients, affect the epidemiological mechanisms tying meat to chronic diseases like cancer?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there is definitely some suggestions that that eating meat as part of phytochemically rich diets can negate some of the potential downsides. So there's various studies that show that, okay, if we consume red meat as part of quote unquote healthy diets, and there's been studies done like the Oxford EPIC cohort, Healthy Shoppers cohort, Albertus Tamara project, that show that if red meat is consumed, not as part of a standard American diet, also rich in ultra processed food, but red meat is consumed as part of a healthy diet, also low in ultra processed foods, rich in fruits, vegetables, and things like that, that we do not see these risks occurring. And in that case, actually, healthy omnivores and vegetarians have similar amounts or similar longevity. And in fact, several studies in very older individuals, such as the blue zones, you often hear blue zones, plant-based, right? Well, there's multiple studies, and it's a little bit romanticized, but actually in various of these studies, such as in the Okinawans, as well as in the Sardinia and Costa Ricans, you see that having a little bit more animal foods is actually associated with longer longevity versus people that only consume plant foods. For instance, in the Okinawan study, they, I think, identified about 20 people that were, I think, over the age of 90 or 100. And surprisingly, they didn't find any vegetarian in there. Everyone was an omnivore. And you see at the older age that having some animal proteins, and I'm not talking about like a full carnivore diet, but having some higher amounts of animal proteins are protective against disease risk and improve longevity. And we know that when we get older, we lose muscle mass and we decrease our functionality, and bioavailable protein becomes very important there. So animal source foods provide bioavailable protein. And we need higher amounts of protein when we age. So having that bioavailable protein could be, for instance, a reason why you see these beneficial associations in older adults. But I do want to highlight is that, yes, when consuming red meat as part of healthy diets, you generally don't see, you see these disease risk in epidemiological studies, you see them dissolve, and you actually see a neutral or sometimes even a relative risk that is below 1, suggesting maybe that there's perceived protective. So again, I want to highlight is that the background diet is so important at which these are consumed. Obviously, if we, let's take an extreme example, if we consume grass-fed beef as part of like a ultra processed diet, then of course the grass-fed beef is not going to make us magically more healthier if we consume all these other ultra processed foods. And the same the other way around, if we consume a very phytochemically rich diet. So that is important to know. The background diet is very important at which individual foods are consumed. So that's why it's always, when you see these epidemiological associations, it's important to be wary. We do not consume nutrients. We do not consume foods. We consume foods as part of complex dietary patterns. And this is going to be the overriding or very important factor, the background diet at which we consume these foods.
Excellent. Well, Stephan, thank you so very much for an enlightening evening. We have numerous compliments. Your work is fascinating, awesome presentation. Thank you so much for a wonderful and enlightening presentation. Very good presentation. Thank you for bringing this information forward. So again, and they go on and on. So Stephan, we are truly grateful for you taking your time this evening to present to our audience. And we look forward to future presentations where you will continue to share with us what you're finding. And
absolutely. It was my absolute pleasure. So
thank you. And we do have our next webinar will be June the 10th, Thursday, June the 10th at 7 p.m. Central Time. And it is entitled Toxic Legacy, How the Weed Killer Glyphosate is Destroying Our Health and the Environment by Dr. Stephanie Seneff. So please tune in for that. And again, Stephan, thank you so very much, sir. Deeply appreciated.
thank you so much. And thank you everyone for attending the webinar. It was a pleasure hearing all your questions. And as always, if you have any more questions or want to discuss this further, feel free to send me an email or just look me up on Google, and I'm happy to discuss. So thank you so much.
Great. And thank you, everyone, and good evening.